Game consoles have been around for the longest time, but they all haven't been quite successful. There's a few consoles out there that actually were pretty big failures that ultimately caused the company that made them to fall apart and go out of business. And so today we're going to be talking about the top 5 video game console flops or failures. Not to be confused with the top 5 worst consoles of all time, that's a completely different list. Starting us off at number 5 is the Virtual Boy from Nintendo that was released back on August 1995 and then discontinued in March 1996. The console failed for many reasons, but ultimately it was because of how rushed it was by Nintendo, who was already working on the Ultra 64 that would go on to become the Nintendo 64. Nintendo expected to sell a total of 3 million units in its first year in Japan alone, but it only sold 770,000 units worldwide, where 140,000 came from America and the rest came from Japan. The console sold so badly that it never actually was released in Europe or Australia. A total of 22 games were released for the Virtual Boy, 14 of which were the only ones that were released in North America. When you think, Nintendo's having a bad time with the Wii U right now, just remember they've had much darker times with the Virtual Boy. You haven't seen nothing yet. Number 4. The Ouya microconsole. The Ouya microconsole was an Android-powered device that was put up on Kickstarter back in 2012 and received a ton of hype and support. The console was announced on July 3rd, 2012, and it was advertised to be an open-source Android console that was supposed to bring gamers back to the TV. Every single console could also double as a developer device, so practically anyone that bought the console could make games for it. And since the device itself was open source, it allowed modders to open up the hardware itself and not just the software, and tinker with whatever they wanted. As far as sales numbers go, no official numbers have been released, but in 2014, Matt Thorson, who released the most popular game on the Ouya at the time, Towerfall, revealed that the game only sold 7,000 units on the console. In 2015, it was revealed that Ouya was trying to sell the company because of an ongoing debt that they couldn't repay. In July 2015, Razer Inc. purchased the Ouya company and acquired all of its employees and assets. It also discontinued the microconsole hardware, leaving it out on the market for only about 3 years before it ultimately got its end. Number 3. The OnLive Cloud Gaming Console. I think OnLive was way ahead of its time. It was a cloud gaming service that allowed people to stream computer games to multiple devices like the OnLive micro console, computers, tablets, and phones that didn't have the efficient hardware to run the game locally. The online game service launched back on June 17, 2010 and allowed gamers to purchase streaming versions of many third-party games like Assassin's Creed Brotherhood and Batman Arkham City. On August 17, 2012, the company laid off all of its employees and the OnLive service was sold for $4.8 million. This was a pretty shocking amount, considering that the company was valued at $1.8 billion just a few years ago. Finally, in April 2015, OnLive announced that the company had sold most of its remaining assets to Sony Computer Entertainment and that it would be shutting down all of its services by April 30th, 2015. Sony actually runs their own cloud gaming service right now for PlayStation services, called PlayStation Now, and it's actually powered by Gaikai, a company they also purchased that was actually a direct competitor to OnLive. So it seems ironic that PlayStation seems to have a monopoly on this whole cloud gaming service now. Number 2. The Sega Saturn. The Sega Saturn was a great console, it just launched terribly. The Sega Saturn was supposed to be Sega's big entry into the 32-bit game era, disregarding the 32X add-on for the Sega Genesis. It was a direct competitor with the PlayStation, but it ultimately ended up failing because of a bad launch start. Originally, the Sega Saturn was supposed to be released September 1996, but at the first official E3 press conference from Sega announced that it was in stores right now in the middle of May, even though we had already announced that it was coming out in September. This pissed off so many retailers. Sega had already shipped 30,000 units of the Sega Saturn to multiple retailers, excluding Walmart, Best Buy, and KB Toys. This single event caused those 3 retailers to drop all Sega products from their lineup. After Sega's announcement, Sony announced that the PlayStation would be sold for $100 less compared to the Saturn. When the Saturn was released during its surprise announcement, 6 games were released at launch. The titles at launch, like Virtua Fighter, were really great, but only 2 games were released between the Saturn's surprise May announcement and the original September release date. For the most part, the Sega Saturn was a fantastic console, but it was ultimately this really rocky and surprise announcement and launch date that pretty much ruined the console from the get-go, and it ultimately made PlayStation win that whole 32-bit war. Number 1. The Sega Dreamcast. The Sega Dreamcast was released in North America on September 9, 1999, and it was supposed to be Sega's comeback from the Sega Saturn failure from earlier years. The Dreamcast was a fantastic console. Right from the launch, there were a lot of great arcade games that were ported over to the console, as well as fantastic new original titles like Sonic Adventure. Sadly, the Dreamcast didn't see any support from third-party developers like EA and Square Enix. The Dreamcast sold pretty well during its first few months on the market. but eventually sales started to slow down after the holiday season, and it only got worse with time. After Sony announced the first details of the new PlayStation 2, people stopped buying into the Dreamcast, and the market sort of froze for a while people waited for the new console to be released. In July 2000, Sony announced a smaller, cheaper version of the PS1 called the PS1. That got many people that were holding off on the Dreamcast to jump into the PlayStation community instead. Later that year in October, Sony released the PlayStation 2 in North America, ultimately putting the nail in the coffin for the Dreamcast and Sega as a hardware console business. Sega was never able to come back in sales with the Dreamcast when the PS2 was released, and by the end of the year 2000, they lost a total of $417 million. That's a lot of money. It was because of all these factors that Sega eventually became the third-party developer we know today, and why they left the home console market. Some of these video game consoles were just ahead of their time, while others were just legitimately really bad. But still, it's really sad to see these consoles flop and ultimately cause their companies a lot of trouble. And so with that said, I'd like to hear what you guys think is the biggest flop in terms of video game consoles. Let me know in the comment section below. If you guys enjoyed this video and want to support my work, consider sharing the video with your friends, as it really helps me out and helps the community grow. I'd love to see more people like you guys. If you enjoyed this video, consider checking out my last two videos, one of them being a Draw My Life to celebrate 15,000 subscribers on this channel. Thank you guys very much. So there's one way for you guys to get to know me if you're new to this channel. The other video is actually a desk tour of my workstation. This is pretty much where I filmed and edit all my videos. So if you want to see what my work setup is like, you can go ahead and check out that video. Other than that, you can find all my social networks and my gaming usernames in the description of the video, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. See you later, guys.